Hi, today I want to talk to you a little bit about a term that comes up a lot in the indie game space at the moment and has done for a while, and that is roguelike. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the debate about what is a roguelike and what is a roguelite. That is a whole thing that's been going on for ages. Ultimately, I think these kind of conversations about genre and putting things into categories are only useful if they are pointed at a particular problem. And the problem I currently see with roguelike is I see a lot of games that are tagged as roguelikes but do not fulfill the basic thing that people often go to roguelikes for. So the question that this video is really aiming to answer is, why do we enjoy roguelikes, or what are the main reasons for that? And I think when people start developing these games, they often go a route that is not helpful, and they kind of sink a lot of time into something that they think is the most important part of a roguelike, and it's not, or at least in my opinion as a designer, it is not the most important part. Now, the problem that I see, and I see this in commercially released games, I see it in games that people send me to look at on the channel, is that procedurally generated levels do not automatically make a game into a roguelike, or more specifically, they are not the secret sauce that makes roguelikes compelling and makes people want to play them over and over again. They're an important part of it, but I would argue that if you are starting on a game in this genre, it is not the important thing to nail and get down first. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute, but to give you an example, Ape Out is a top-down action game. The levels are different each time. That performs a function. It means you can't just learn the layout of the level and speedrun it. You have to play in a way that is reactive and adaptive to the environment you go through. But Ape Out does not market itself as an action roguelike, and that is because it's not. Steam has an action roguelike tag for games like Vampire Survivors or Rogue Legacy or Spelunky, and Ape Out is not in that category. And there is a reason for that, and this reason is going to tie directly into this thing that I think you should be focusing on if the game you're making is a roguelike or wants to appeal to people who like those games. Now, there is a concept that we use a lot in board game design, and people who play heavier board games will be familiar with this terminology, and people who play collectible card games will probably be familiar with this, and people who play video games that have any element of like strategically building up a character. So this applies to MOBAs, it applies to sort of loot grindy games like Diablo and Path of Exile, but it's the concept of engine building, right? So in an engine building game, you are making strategic decisions to build up a thing, whether it's a character, it doesn't have to be a character, it could be a vehicle, it could be something more abstract like a business, but you are gradually building up a thing, and then you are piloting it through a situation, and all of the strategic decisions that you've made to create that thing are then paying off as you pilot it through that dungeon or whatever tests are in the game. It doesn't necessarily have to be a combat game, but obviously in combat games like MOBAs, we can like think about how, oh, you can build a DPS build or you can build a tank build. You are building an engine that is then piloted and operated in a particular way, and the ideal payoff is seeing that engine work in a great way when you put it into that environment. Engine building exists in loads and loads of types of games. We see it in auto battlers, we see it in like deck builders. It doesn't necessarily have to be a roguelike game, but a lot of the roguelikes that have been really successful and that have players that are really devoted to them have this quality to them. And that is, in my mind, the central thing that a roguelike needs to have. So I've had this situation multiple times on this channel now where someone has sent me a game and it's got a procedurally generated level, and they think that is enough to call it a roguelike. Now, this isn't about just putting things in categories to be pedantic, right? It is making sure that you are like targeting the right audience with your game, because people who like roguelikes, they like them because of the engine building. And the procedural generation, the stuff where it's going to be different every time, that is more there so that, every time you go in, you might try a slightly different build, and you can never fully anticipate what is going to be used to test that build because of the randomization and the algorithm kind of determining, the layout of levels or the types of enemies or traps you're going to encounter or whatever it is. Again, it doesn't necessarily need to be a combat-driven game. It could be some other type of game. But the point is that the loop that makes up a roguelike where you kind of try and fail, it's only really made compelling by the fact that the player can make a different thing each time and see how it fares in that environment, right? This is why Ape Out is such a good example. It's a fantastic game. It's a really fun action game and it's beautiful, but it is not a roguelike. The levels change, but the player character never changes. Monkey is just Monkey. Monkey, no change. Now, one of the things that a lot of the successful roguelikes do, and this applies across subgenres, so this applies to like Rogue Legacy, which is like a action platformer roguelike based on things like Castlevania. It applies to Slay the Spire and card-driven games, and it even applies to a bullet heaven game like Vampire Survivors, where there's very little in the way of a level in the first place. But what these games all do is they take the typical experience of an RPG, which is leveling up a character and making decisions about their progression and their skill developments, and taking that experience, which might take 200 hours, and squashing it down to something that you can play in like 10 to 90 minutes. I love RPGs, I've grown up playing all sorts of RPGs, I love tabletop RPGs, and I love investing in a character, but they always end up in this paradoxical situation where you either need to make your game a lot shorter and lock players out of choices so that they have a reason to play it again and experience, how it feels different to be a wizard versus how it feels to be a rogue. Or you go for the kind of kitchen sink approach, which a lot of Bethesda games do, where you can play a single playthrough and do everything and be everything, and you can be like the head of the Thieves Guild and also the head of the Town Guard and be good at everything. And those games tend to feel like you're going to have a distinct route through the game at the start, and then towards the end it's just like, well, you have enough skill points to do everything and you can basically do everything in one playthrough of the game. Big RPGs always end up in this situation of having to go that way or having to sort of do the other route of making players' decisions more permanent and like locking them out of a bunch of stuff. So when you join the Thieves Guild, you can no longer be in the Wizards Guild or that kind of stuff. A lot of bigger RPGs don't like to do that kind of stuff. And what that means is you do tend to end up with this experience where every big RPG or action RPG has you playing this sort of Swiss Army knife character that doesn't feel specialized or interesting anymore. The great thing about the loop of a roguelike is you can take that and compress it into a game that takes, less than an hour or maybe just over an hour, and that means that you can play the game and be a rogue and then play the game again and be a wizard and play the game again and be a fighter. You're not investing loads of time in that thing, so it gives you more space to experiment with things that you wouldn't typically do. Whereas when we sit down to play 100 to 100 hour RPG, we tend to like fall into the type of character we like to play because we know we've got to invest all of that time and effort into playing that character for a long period of time. All of this is to say that Slay the Spire, Rogue Legacy, Vampire Survivors, they're three examples of different types of roguelike games which are all compressing that long form RPG progression into what we call a run, right? It's a different game structure, it's a run. And the thing about having a game that is based on runs rather than single long playthroughs is it forces players to experiment more, and that is really the heart of what people love about these games. If you're currently working on a game and you think it's a roguelike, please take on board everything I've just said for a number of reasons. One is it will stop you marketing the game to the wrong sort of people, because if it's just a action game with some random elements in, that's fine. I love Ape Out, but people who love roguelikes do not just love them because of the procedurally generated levels. The other thing I would say is that you need to design the kind of strategic heart of your game, the different kind of engines or builds that you can make, before you worry about the environment that is taking place in. So personally, if I was sitting down and I was trying to make the next Slay the Spire, or I was trying to make the next Vampire Survivors or whatever, the way I would approach it is to think about the extremes in my engine. And I might pick 2 classes, or whatever is the equivalent of classes in your game's world. I might say the wizard and the thief, and design those first. And I would test them out in a set dungeon that does not have the procedural generation in. Because the thing about prototyping games is you need to test the unknowns, right? We know that procedurally generated levels do a particular thing. That's like a given, right? We understand that it's good for players to have a slightly different experience each time and things to be in a different place. It stops things getting stale. That is not a concept that you, as a designer, need to test by prototyping it. You may feel an urge to build that algorithm for designing your dungeons because you don't know how to do it yet at a technical level. But at a design level, it is not really something you need to test early on. What you need to do early on is test the engine building, and you do that by picking a few extreme examples of very different types of builds someone might build, and then you design those, test them in the environment, and then later on you can start adding the procedural generation to the environment, and you can start adding more classes and things that could be mixed together to make different types of builds, or however your game is structured. But remember that the engine building is the thing that you need to design first, because that is what your game actually is. The procedural generation for the levels is just a kind of way of dealing with a content problem. And as far as design goes, it's already solved. We know what function that performs. You don't need to test it until later on in your game, when you know that you actually have a game. And to give you an example of this from a wildly successful big commercial game that is not a roguelike but has had a roguelike mode, when Hearthstone was being prototyped for a very, very long time, I think even for like 2 or 3 years, the original prototype only had 2 classes. That number went up to 8, 9, 10 eventually over the last few years, but they prototyped the whole game with 2 classes. And what that helps you to do is to define your design space of what the rest of the game is meant to be. This is how commercial game designers do something. They don't just kind of look at a game they want to make and go, right, what does this game have in it? I'm going to build all of those things in my game engine. You start from the stuff that you need to work out. That's what prototyping is. Like, prototyping isn't just a sloppy early version of a game. It is like a test product where you specifically focus on the things that you're not sure about, the ideas you want to test, the stuff that's new. This is why I keep harping on about how the procedural generation of your levels is not the important thing. You can test a prototype with a set of pre-made levels and then build the procedural generation later on. In the example of the Hearthstone prototype, they would have built what we in collectible card games call a control deck and an aggro deck, right? A control is usually like some sort of tanky character that is based on defense and based on just taking as much as possible until they can build up to some big finishing spell or some type of play that wipes loads of stuff out at once. And an aggro deck is a much more aggressive deck that is based on just going fully attack as quickly as possible, right? If you are making a roguelike and you're not familiar with those terms of like aggro and control, then they're really good terms to get your head around, because they tend to define the like extreme different ends of the spectrum when it comes to building engines in engine building games. You have types of player that like to play control, and you have types of player that like to play aggro, and you can look at any build-based game like a Diablo or in any of the action roguelikes that I've mentioned in this video, and you can start to see how putting particular items or skills together adds up to a control-based build or an aggro-based build. I hope that's all made sense. I hope this has been helpful to you if you're working on games or you just want a better understanding. Remember, what I'm interested in is helping you to understand what gamers like about a particular genre. I'm sure some clever person in the comments is going to be able to find examples of roguelikes that don't have engine building in or whatever, but by and large, this is what appeals to people about this genre. And if you want to design games that's successful, if you want to make games that people actually want to play, then you need to pay attention to that element. Is like the thing that makes most roguelikes fun is the feel of building a character and being able to experiment, because you are probably going to die in the next half hour anyway and have to start again, right? The experimentation that comes out of that is the part that makes the game interesting. And if you don't have anything to experiment with, then the game is failing at providing what people want out of that genre of games.